My name's Helena Paul and I'm co-director of EcoNexus, which is a small public interest research organisation. And we research all kinds of things. I've worked on land rights and forests, and more recently I've worked on things like genetic engineering, geoengineering, and now the new breeding technologies, which are the new genetic engineering. With the election, it's very important to realise that, of course, the Tories are, although there are some traditional landowners who might be resistant to GM, the main body of the Tory party is definitely not resistant. And George Eustice, the Minister for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has indicated his willingness, after Brexit, to consider completely relaxing the rules on GM in the UK. So I think that's a clear indication of what the Tory government will think of doing if it remains in power. I think the media has got rather lazy in recent years. I feel as though very often they don't actually examine issues for themselves very closely. There are a few honourable exceptions to that, and some of them have been around for a very, very long time. I won't mention any names, but they are excellent and they do their work thoroughly. But I can't help thinking that some of the up-and-coming journalists tend to parrot stories that they receive, and rather like a nameless journalist who told me in the past, your press release was really all I needed to write the article. And basically the article was largely based on the press release. And so if you simply take a press release from one source and don't actually do your background work, then you tend to get a rather distorted point of view. And this is notable in certain parts of the press. A very good organisation to refer to is the GM Freeze, of which I was chair for many years, though I'm no longer chair. It has actually a manifesto about the election, and it's calling for careful controls and regulation in order to deal with the potential problems of Brexit and GM. It wants care about animals. It wants particularly labelling of food, which will be highly important, because of course GM food was introduced to the United States without any kind of notification through labelling. So people had no idea that their food was being changed, certainly not at first. So they're calling for very strict labelling, and they're also calling for protection against contamination of non-GM crops by GM, or contamination indeed of feed, non-GM feed and food by GM feed and food. And they're also looking to be sure that when supermarkets decide to sell products with GM in them, they are properly labelled and everyone is properly notified, including the GM Freeze, of these new products. So they are a very important resource. Whoever is elected, of course, we are committed to Brexit. And the problem with Brexit is this, that once outside the EU, the UK won't have to abide by EU regulations, because the EU has always enshrined the precautionary principle in its legislation, which is a careful approach to innovation. And the UK government for a long time has been saying that they object to the precautionary principle because it's a barrier to innovation, and so they want to install an innovation principle alongside it or instead of it. And basically the British government, ever since the first GM came along, has been saying what we need is these new technologies. We can get patents, we can make a lot of money, we can be leaders in these technologies. So each time they come, they say, yes, we'll jump on this particular bandwagon. So basically leaving Europe is going to leave the UK and its government and people extremely exposed to so-called innovation, and also exposed to the risk of old GM crops being promoted here for planting. Now, of course, I should say that the EU has always imported, and the UK as well, large quantities of GM animal feed. And this is an issue that's kind of under-discussed, because GM animal feed is part of our diet, in the sense that if you eat eggs, bacon or meat that is not organic, you are likely to be eating the product of GM crops. And organisations like the GM Freeze have made a great effort to address this issue, but it's been extremely difficult to do that, and the supermarkets have not responded. Once we've done Brexit, it's quite likely that the UK and the US will come to some sort of arrangement which may lead to, especially if TTIP doesn't go through, then the UK will be open to many more exports from the US. And of course, then our farmers will say, in order to compete with the US, we need to plant GM as well. Of course, many GM crops are failing, but we've got the new technologies coming along as well. And the promotion of those will go ahead much more swiftly with Brexit. Well, hungry corporations, remarkably, is still extremely relevant. It's about corporate concentration, how the corporations have gained control over so much of agriculture. And basically, this process is continuing. It's also about how the forces of globalization are pushing ahead all the time. Now, with corporate concentration, what we see now is that the 6 corporations that used to dominate have now become 3. And so the issue is even more important than ever. And you see that, for example, Monsanto is being taken over by Bayer. DuPont and Dow are going to merge. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, ChemChina is likely to take over Syngenta. Now, all these are subject to agreement from the different governments, but I'm afraid governments are not necessarily notably good at deciding against these kinds of mergers. So they are likely to go ahead. Now, another reason why hungry corporations is important is the issue of seed. Because actually one of the issues that's been greatly neglected over the last few years is the disappearance of our seeds. And in fact, that's going at a major rate. And even where they don't disappear completely, quite often the knowledge about how to deal with seeds, about how to germinate them, for example, has disappeared, as have many of the people who are their guardians. Because their traditional guardians of farmer-bred seed have been women. And women are marginalized in industrial agriculture and are often the victims of attempts to push them off their land, men taking over where cash crops are involved. And so women's knowledge and women's control of seed supply is much under threat, and that's something that we talked about quite a lot. And finally, there's the issue of public relations. Now, the founder of public relations, Edward Bernays, had a great name for it all. He called it the engineering of consent. And as I see it, advertising is getting even more cunning these days, with social media targeting you personally for your preferences. So I imagine that advertising is actually becoming even more powerful psychologically than ever before. So hungry corporations remains extremely relevant. The merger between Bayer and Monsanto is going to be extremely interesting in that respect. Those two companies have an enormous amount of potential benefit to gain from each other, since Bayer is a major agrotoxics producer. And of course, Monsanto has experienced such problems trying to get into Europe that if it can get into Europe via Bayer, it will be very happy. And I really don't know if European governments are going to find themselves able to resist the pressures of this huge new corporate presence. And I think that that's probably where the major threat comes from. With the new breeding technologies, as they are called, which involve synthetic biology and things like gene editing, we have a major new problem for both the public and for the EU and for UK scientists and observers. In that, it's often claimed that the new breeding techniques are not GM, because they don't actually contain GM material for one reason or another. There are claims that they are not genetically modified, and therefore they do not need to be regulated. And since gene editing is such a swift matter, and since it can be done so rapidly and so easily, and there are new offerings coming online all the time about what could be done with it, I think the sheer flood of promises is going to prove rather hard to resist, especially since there's huge work going on with the PR industry and with corporate interests to basically say that they're not GM and that there's no problems with them, we needn't worry. But if you look at medical research, it's now been shown very clearly that with gene editing, large numbers of extra mutations take place in the target organism. And therefore, as with genetic modification, these unintended effects, these mutations, they could be beneficial, but they could also be harmful. And if you're examining a new GM crop, you don't necessarily look for them. So there's a whole pathway for new problems to enter into agriculture and into our food and into our health via GM crops causing unintended mutations, even the so-called new ones.